Hello, this is Paul Johnson with the New Frontiers. Now, this is not a normal moment in American politics. We even have moderate left commentators like Ezra Klein who are arguing that we're not headed towards authoritarianism, thinks we're living through authoritarianism. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. But what I do see is a wholesale reshuffling of the rules where the very balance of power that has guided our democracy is being revisited and revised, and in some cases, quietly dismantled. Now, that to me is enough. I don't need to use incendiary terms like authoritarian or dictator or king to be alarmed by it. When Donald Trump used emergency powers in unconventional ways to push through his agenda without Congress, he's setting a precedent. And it is only inevitable that Democrats, when they're in power, will be tempted to use those same levers. When Donald Trump uses the emergency clause to pass staggering changes like worldwide tariffs, it's inevitable that the Democrats will use those same emergency powers to one day pass their extreme agenda. That's the real danger of this moment. Once those guardrails are broken, once we allow the whims of one man to overpower the Constitution, no party will be eager to put them back. Now, I know that's not new, but it is reaching a terminal velocity today. Yet my concern is not only about the rules being rewritten, it's really about the people who are meant to defend them who are failing us. The Democratic Party has just failed to rise to the occasion. And Republicans, for their part, shrunk from their responsibility as well. In Arizona, we see elected officials that they're just hiding in plain sight. They're afraid to challenge Trump, but they're also willing or unwilling to challenge the progressives on their left. Their answer is far too often paralysis. And as they stand still, the balance of power slips away. Now, here's what I believe. The only credibility an elected official truly has comes from the courage to challenge their own side, not just the other side. That kind of courage has become a scarce resource. Instead, our politics has collapsed into a single dividing line. Those who support Trump and those who oppose him. But there's another path. I see a bright light in our future. Across this country, independents and unaffiliated voters are growing faster than either party. They're conservatives, liberals, and genuine independents alike, and they share one thing in common, and that is disgust at what the two major parties have become. Yet these voters have been systematically boxed out. They can't meaningfully participate in primaries. They aren't courted by party mailers. And in places like Arizona, an independent who wants to run for office has to gather nearly 45,000 signatures compared to only 6,000 for a Republican or a Democrat. And so as the parties double down on their economic extremism and social radicalism, the only thing that unites those two parties any longer is the hatred that they share for one another, and their opposition to any meaningful reform that would include these independent voters back in the process. So we have these two parties who want you to think that everything is binary. Either you support labor or business or education, God or human rights. Well, how can you be pro-labor without being pro-business? How can you be supportive of business without supporting education? And you think God doesn't support human rights? These things are connected, and change is possible. We're building a political vehicle that is already on the ballot in Arizona, one that invites independents into the process, that encourages their voices to be heard, and that seeks common ground between Democrats and Republicans. What we need now are bright, capable people who are willing to step forward. If you've ever thought about running for office, if you've ever believed that this country deserves better than what we have, I'm asking you to reach out. Contact me at paul@optamerican.com. Let me know you're interested. Now, I am just an ordinary, optimistic American who believes that this nation remains one of history's greatest causes for good. But I also know this is a clarion call, a call to others who love this country and who refuse to accept that our only choice is between these two broken parties. We deserve better, and it starts with those of you who are willing to lead. So with that, let's move into our continuing conversation about how both sides are failing to address the real problems of America. More importantly, how maybe we can begin to fix them. Last week, we focused on the Democratic Party and how it's become toxic and ineffective. Today, we're going to focus a little more on Republicans. I believe the voices from both of these parties, from Democrats and Republicans, are important, but so are the independent voices that are being shut out. Or see our problems from an independent view. It's not only okay now for you to disagree with me. In fact, I think it's vital that oftentimes we have disagreement if democracy is going to survive. So join in the discussion. Leave your comments. Most importantly, run. If you like what we're doing, push that subscribe button and let's get on with this show.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon and disticate and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
All right, I'd like to welcome both of my guests here back today, the panel. We've got a pretty heavy docket, some great things to talk about. Specifically, we're going to be focused a little bit on a couple of Bob Robb's columns. He wrote some great columns this week, last 2 weeks anyway. Bob, how are you today? Are you up in Munns Park?
I am up in Munns Park. Good to be with you.
With that, I will just go to Henry. Henry, how are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Paul. You'd be surprised, I just rode my bike again in the heat, and I survived. So here we are.
Oh, there you are. And you haven't cut a deal yet for Elliot's, what was it, yellow Porsche or whatever it was?
Oh, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about it. I have first right of refusal when he wants to get rid of that Porsche because his knees are too bad to get in and out of it.
Yeah, I don't understand that at all. I mean, these little sports cars you get in. Of course, I'm 6'7", so my knees kind of hit anything that has a dashboard attached to it.
Maybe they could make some sort of a little crane, like a little crane that he could use to get in and out of the sports car. Now, that's a business idea for the aging population, cranes to get in and out of the sports car.
So I've been flush and thin in my life. Here's one little story. One time when I was thinner than flusher, I ended up having to take a Honda Civic and drive it for a couple of months. But the car would not, the front seat I didn't have enough legroom. So I took it down. I had this guy adjust it where he moved the tracks further back. And that way I could slide the seat further back. But what it did is the little divide between the front window and the back window, my head ended up being behind it. So people would watch me driving down the road with it looking like I'm in the back seat. I got all these double looks, but at least my knees would fit into the car. So
that's great. I love it.
All right. So let's do this. There's a lot going on in the world today. In the last session, we focused on the challenges with the Democratic Party, how toxic it's become, how it's literally become an anchor around many of the candidates' necks who are now having to run with it. They're challenged in a variety of ways. The New York Times did a great story on how much trouble they're in. But that kind of underscores how much trouble maybe the other side is in as well. And so I thought what we'd focus today is we'd focus on what's going on a little bit more on the right side. We won't ignore the left altogether, but let's talk about your column, Bob. You wrote a great column about an issue that came up this week that I thought was interesting, which was Xi's big parade. He had a big parade. He brought in a group of the axis of authoritarians. They all stood up there with him on stage. That, for some reason, irritated Trump, but it went beyond just beyond Iran and Russia and China. There were a whole group of other people there as well, a number of other countries that participated, one of them being India with Modi. Would you talk about your article and what it was that you saw?
Yes, I thought that Modi cozying up with both Putin and Xi at the Shanghai Cooperation Committee meeting that preceded the military parade wasn't just for show or to send a signal to Trump. I think it was a reaffirmation of India's longstanding intent to be non-aligned, not to join any competitive blocs. That was most prominent during the Cold War years. And to the extent there is a competition now between democratic capitalism and authoritarianism, Modi, I think, was indicating that India was not going, contrary to the hopes of the democratic world for some time, to be joining as a full-fledged member of a democratic alliance intended to contain China. And I think the proximate cause of that reaffirmation of non-alignment, represented by his activity and presence at the Shanghai meeting, was the very rude treatment that India got, an unexplainable treatment that India got from Trump's tariffs. India has the highest, except for China, tariff rate in the entire world. And they aren't a significant contributor to the extent that you buy Trump's view that trade deficits are an indication of economic weakness or maltreatment. India is only responsible for less than 3% of imports into the United States and less than 5% of the trade deficit. So while it has been since the George W. Bush era a significant strategic imperative from the United States to try to bring India closer into alignment with the United States and fellow democracies in the Indo-Pacific, this completely blew that out of the water. There's utterly no reason now for India to believe that its long-term interests are served or advanced by cooperation with the United States in either economics or security.
Do you think that part of it was also caused because of the, I don't know if you'd call it a gaffe, but the issue where Trump seemed to move more to Pakistan side than India side early on within the first few months of the administration?
There have been reports of a personal breach between Modi and Trump. Not so much initially over siding, particularly with Pakistan, but Trump taking credit for having resolved the conflict between the two. And that may have precipitated the additional 25% tariff on India for supposedly importing Russian oil. But of the three largest importers of Russian oil, China, India, and Turkey, only India was singled out for that particular punitive treatment. So I don't know what the interplay personally that occurred between Trump and Modi and what that might have contributed to his subsequent decision to go and make a display of going to the Shanghai Cooperation Committee meeting. But if you ignore those personal factors and just look at objective fact, the gross mistreatment of India with respect to tariffs couldn't have had any effect except to cause India, independent of any personal relations, to reach the conclusion that their future really doesn't lie with closer alignment with the United States.
Henry, you spent a lot of time looking at foreign policy issues, and of course, you started your career overseas. How do you see this? Do you see there as being a major reshuffling that's going on right now? Is this a boon going on to the axis of authoritarians, or is this just kind of a natural consequence? How do you shake out, especially on India, but going beyond that to other countries throughout the world?
I think that the alliance, or the sort of alliance of convenience at the moment between especially Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran is a real thing. These countries don't have a lot in common except for that they are the adversaries of the United States. But as that goes on for longer, they develop closer links, right? So they develop closer economic links, for example, with China importing Russian oil, or North Korea and China exporting weapons to Russia to use in the war against Ukraine. So as this situation goes on for longer, that axis, sort of starts to become more coherent and starts to hang together in new ways, which is not good for the United States. There's a big contradiction here, which is that the Trump administration claims that China is the biggest threat to the United States security, economic development, et cetera, et cetera. And yet it seems to be pushing other major powers, especially India, and to some degree, you could say Russia, into closer alliance with China, when the United States should really be doing everything it can to isolate China geopolitically and economically and split those countries away from China. Now, in the case of Russia, obviously, that's extremely difficult to do when Russia's at war against Ukraine and seems to be very, very difficult to try and reach any resolution of that. But in the case of India, it seems like an own goal that the United States is pushing India closer to China, even though India is a neighbor of China, a geopolitical rival of China, has had low-level military conflict with China over the years, and should be a natural candidate for the United States to try and bring over to its side to isolate China. So that is a problem for the United States. I think that the US should be moving in the other direction, to bit by bit reach out to countries and to try and bring them over to the United States side. And the tariffs have not helped on this. Trump's personal sort of conflicts with some of these global leaders haven't helped, although I would say that those seem to be relatively quick to be forgotten. For example, in Europe, some of the real hysteria against Trump in the United States seems to have sort of calmed down in the last couple of months. But it's definitely not in the US long-term strategic interest to be pushing large countries towards closer relations with China rather than in the opposite direction.
Well, yeah, it seems to me, I mean, Europe at the end of the day, especially because of the threat from Russia, they need the United States. They know that they need the United States, and so they're gonna go further than they might otherwise go to try and hold that relationship together. Because again, if they're going to be successful in this Russian threat, they need the U.S. It's not true with India. India, while they have a huge dispute with China, I think India would like to be a bigger economic player, and they see themselves as being economically competitive with China. But at the end of the day, they've played this game of kind of a strategic ambivalence, playing between the two worlds for many, many, many years, for many administrations. What I think the big worry here is that we're pushing them in that direction. So when you look at this, here's a question that that I would ask on this. Xi made the comment in this last conference. He said that we're moving towards a multipolar world. And of course, what that really is, that's a signal to North Korea and to Iran and to Russia that they're going to have more influence over their spheres. But I don't really believe that's China's goal. I think China sees it much the way many people in the United States see it, which is there's a two-polar world today. There's a Cold War going on of some effect between the United States and China, and they are growing as an economic power. They're also growing as a military power, and increasingly they're threatening us on multiple fronts. And if that in fact is true, anything that we're doing to push other countries in their direction is going to be a net negative for us. How do you see that?
I agree with that on the whole, although the Cold War was a much more global confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union than what we're seeing at the moment, right? I mean, in Europe, the main adversary is Russia. They are completely preoccupied with the Russian threat and the Russian war in Ukraine. In the Pacific, the situation is very different, and the focus is on China. But even in India, for example, it's not been dragged into this global confrontation between the two superpowers like it tended to be in the Cold War. So the global situation is a little bit more complex. When China says that it's calling for a multipolar world, what I see that as almost a blanket term, sort of read what you want into it, but you won't be talking about hegemony of the United States. So when Russia hears multipolar world, what they think is, oh, great, this is a world in which Russia has dominion, influence, hegemony over Ukraine, Belarusia, Central Asia, parts of the Caucasus. That's what Russia wants. When India hears multipolar world, it thinks, oh, this is a world in which India, along with China and the United States and perhaps the EU, are the major decision makers. And when China hears multipolar world, it probably actually is thinking bipolar world between the United States and China, right? So the Chinese are using a term that allows all these different actors to interpret what they want into it, which is getting them on board, at least rhetorically. And what's important is that the United States at the moment doesn't have an equivalent narrative to present to the world for a system in which they can all get what they want. That's not what the United States seems to be offering, even its allies in Europe. And so there's a problem at the moment. And this hasn't been worked out by the Trump administration, how it can do what it wants to do, for example, to import less from abroad, to have fewer American military and defense investments and troops abroad, but at the same time to offer a system that other countries can opt into and achieve their goals. I don't think that the Trump administration has been able to come up with that sort of a paradigm or that sort of a model yet.
Yeah, Bob, I agree with Henry's point on this. The Trump administration, in my opinion, has the murkiest foreign policy of any president that I've seen in decades. And I'll even go beyond that. I think George Bush made a big strategic error in his war with Iraq. And most people look at the effect that had on the Middle East. There was kind of a Sunni Shia split between Iraq and Iran. By getting involved in that war, we basically pushed the power more towards Iran. And many people, including folks out of the military college, saw it as a strategic mistake. If that was a strategic mistake, I think tariffs are a strategic mistake on a global level, not just on a Middle East basis. I have many challenges with tariffs. I think tariffs are just a bad fundamental economic policy, but I also think that they're a disaster from a foreign policy standpoint. How do you see the issue that Henry was talking about, which is what is the foreign policy of this administration?
Well, it's erratic, seat of the pants, and whatever catches Trump's fancy at any given moment. Part of what I think the problem with Trump's foreign policy is that he seems to believe that the United States still has the geopolitical influence and clout that it did immediately in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's just not the world we live in anymore. And so the United States can't simply make demands and assume that other countries are going to march to whatever we desire. And multipolar geopolitical environment, I think, is just shorthand for less influence for the United States. And I agree with you that tariffs are not only a terrible economic policy, but the way Trump has implemented them has been a foreign policy disaster, because there is no economic rationale behind the rates that he imposes on various countries. That makes it feel personal, and it is personal. India being a prime example of that, Brazil being another prime example, where Trump is angry at an internal investigation occurring of an attempted coup, allegedly, by the previous president, who happened to be very close to Trump. So Brazil has a 50% tariff rate. That has zero to do with any economic relationship between the United States and Brazil or any imbalance in our trade. So the fact that Trump has not used the tariffs exclusively as an economic mechanism to try to either provide the protectionism for U.S. domestic manufacturing, which is one economic rationale for a tariff, or to generate trade concessions and create better terms of trade for the United States and other countries, which is another economic justification for tariffs. He's pursued neither of those two approaches. And so it feels random and creates a sense that the United States is just now not a trustworthy global player. And so you don't have to prefer authoritarianism to democracy to say that a unstable, unsteady global player perhaps should have less influence in the world.
Henry, you're a professor that's in both political economics, so let me try to run this by you and get your thoughts on it. So it seems to me with tariffs, the one thing that we're I think, almost universally convinced of is that tariffs tend to provide friction on the economic engine and they slow growth. Growth has really been the fundamental benefit that Western democracies have provided. The idea, increasingly, as more countries went to Western democracy, they experienced more growth. That growth ended up resulting in more benefits being given to more people. Even if you believe that tariffs might economically help the United States, it is a net sum, a zero-sum game where we know that it will cost other people around the world. It will cost them in terms of growth. So the question that I'm interested in is, what type of system does the best in a low-growth environment? It seems to me, capitalism does very well when it's providing growth, but it really isn't that great when you start having low growth periods of time. In fact, it can create a large amount of inequality as an economy begins to move backwards, because oftentimes the people who are in power stay in power and they have the ability to extract more goods. Now, socialism, on the other hand, does bad even in a good economy. I don't think it's going to do any better in a bad economy. But there are two areas where I think you can see some benefit in a slow growth economy. One is communism, and that's assuming you get complete control over the individual, meaning you can get them to buy into that they've been suppressed so much and they're terrified to be able to react against it, so they just follow you regardless. But the other one is this whole concept of imperialism and mercantilism, the idea that what I think China's doing, certainly they're communistic, but they also have an imperialistic mindset, as does Russia. To me, that's what's going on in Ukraine. Their goal is that when they begin to suffer economically at home, if they can take over new territory, new tax base, new raw materials, new resources, if they can inscript their people into the military to serve for them so their people don't at home, they actually can provide an economy that benefits even in a lower growth environment. My question is, first, do you agree with that analysis that capitalism may not do so well in a slow growth environment? And do you agree that maybe what we're doing with tariffs, at minimum outside the United States, probably is going to result in a lower growth environment?
Great question. The way I see it is that there is more of a link between the level of development and regime type than there is between growth rates. So it's kind of a little bit of a complex argument.
What does that mean?
So if a country is rich, they're more likely to be democratic. Very, very strong empirical evidence that rich countries tend to be democratic, and that poor countries tend to be autocratic, whether they're communist regimes, military dictatorships, personalist dictatorships. They're all more prevalent around poorer countries. Now, as countries become richer, they tend to transition to democracy for various different reasons. But once they've transitioned to democracy, there's not a lot of evidence that low growth caused them to backslide, right? So we saw economic crises after the oil crisis in a lot of developed countries that, by the way, were a lot poorer then than they are now, right? Living standards in the 70s in places like Italy or France were really bad compared to today. These were relatively underdeveloped countries, but they didn't backslide into authoritarianism. So there's also not a lot of evidence that low rates of growth under dictatorships tends to stabilize them in any way. It's more that once they do grow and people reach a certain level of prosperity, the system is more likely to transition to democracy. What I think is also really important to consider is that democracy tends to deliver growth because it tends to restrain things like tariffs and undue regulations, unfair tax burdens, expropriation by the state, repression. All of these things tend to be restrained by democracy, so it tends to promote economic development. That doesn't mean that democracies always have great economic policy or the best economic policy. What it means is that because governments tend to get voted out when they underperform economically, they tend to get replaced by governments that have a little bit of a better record. And so I think that between these two mechanisms, that democracies tend to emerge in richer countries and they tend to promote better policies, I think that we're not going to see a big effect of these developments on developing countries in the short run. But in the long run, it is certainly true that if the international trading system completely breaks down and these countries can't develop, then it's likely that political transitions that could have happened won't happen because these countries will remain economically stagnant and there won't be pressure for political reform.
Yeah, and so Henry, I don't know if you followed today the replacement of the prime minister in France. I found that to be interesting,
Right.
and much of it tied to economics and the budget and the fact that he was trying to create an austerity set of measures, complicated by tariffs and a slowing economy, as well as how much aid they're going to have to give. How do you see what was happening in France in relationship to this?
Yeah, that's an example of a democratic government trying to be responsive to its economic conditions, right? France has been living basically beyond its means for a very long time. The government debt burden has reached a level that it's going to become, I believe, in 3 or 4 years, the biggest item on their government spending bill, right? The French have got this huge welfare state, and yet in about 3 or 4 years, they're going to be spending more to service their debt than they are on their welfare state. So this is just a level of spending that the current government, Macron's government, saw as economically and politically unsustainable. So they're trying to change it by cutting back on welfare payments, by maybe trying to lift the retirement age, these sorts of things. And the parliament revolted. The parliamentarians didn't want to support this law. And so Macron's prime minister has failed in the parliament, and there'll have to be a new prime minister, a new government. But the difference is that it's a democracy, so they're trying, and they can be punished, right, by the voters' representatives, but at least they're trying. In dictatorships, it's much more arbitrary, the policy-making process. There's no pushback, there's no accountability, and a lot of autocracies, if they were in similar dire straits, there'd be nothing pushing them to try and reform the situation. There would be no accountability whatsoever.
Bob, how do you see this whole question, which is if tariffs do lower growth around the world, what effect is that going to have on their political systems, and what challenges will that end up creating not only for their governments, but maybe eventually the U.S.?
I think Trump's tariff regime is particularly indefensible with respect to poor countries. He has applied fairly significant levels of tariffs the minimum tariff across the world is 10%, and many poor developing countries have higher tariff rates. To the extent they have trade imbalances with the United States, they're insignificant. The mother lode with respect to trade deficit for the United States is China, and to a lesser extent, the European Union. These countries don't have trade deficits with the United States because they don't want to buy American products. It's because they don't have the money to buy American products. And by making it more difficult for them to participate in the international trading system, and particularly to cut off access to the American consumer market, he is both making it more difficult for them to develop and following Henry's formulation, therefore more difficult to make the transition from some form of autocracy to democracy. And from the standpoint of U.S. economics, it's just a meaningless act in terms of what it means to us, but it can have a significant impact on these poor countries in cutting off their sources of optimism. And the best pathway to moving towards the kind of values that the United States has always believed were universal.
So I'm going to use this as a moment to transition. Bob, you also wrote an article on how the current GOP, has very little to be able to offer small growth conservatives or small government conservatives. If you would you talk about that a little bit for me?
Sure. There's two things that have happened recently that sort of bring that home in a much sharper and dramatic way. It had been true for some time now, but two events sort of brought it sharply into focus. The first was the Trump Truth Social, in which he said that the states were mere agents of the federal government in terms of administering elections and had to do whatever the federal government said in the form of the President of the United States with respect to the administration of elections. And there is a specific constitutional provision directly on point that contradicts both of those. And what made it or hit me particularly hard was that it was a rejection of the notion of dual sovereignty, that the federal government, the national government, and the state governments both are sovereign entities and sovereign within their respective realms, which was a foundational premise for the approval of the Constitution. If Trump's view had been viewed as what the Constitution provided, it never would have been approved. And the notion of dual sovereignty is sort of a fundamental small government conservative tenet to try to keep the federal government within its realm and to allow the states to have their full sovereignty within their own realm. Even more troubling was the increasing practice of Donald Trump and his administration in demanding shares of companies or percentages of revenue for government approvals that are necessary for businesses to continue to engage in their respective enterprises. The federal government had to approve the acquisition of U.S. steel by Nippon Steel. And as a price of that approval, Trump demanded what's known as a golden share in the acquired company, giving him individually, the President of the United States, veto power over decisions about plant closings or even labor layoffs or plant openings. The chip manufacturers want to sell some more chips, different kinds of chips to China. Well, Trump says, okay, we can approve that, but we get 15% of the revenue. And then most recently, he's bad-mouthing the CEO of Intel. It should not be the business of the President of the United States to be interfering in the inner management of private companies. And in order for him not to do that, he said, well, give me 10% of the company. And even more if you decide to get out of the foundry business, which is one of the things that many analysts think is causing some of Intel's performance problems. These interventions into the private economy, demanding shares, partial ownership, demanding shares of revenue, is a far greater violation of free market principles than the left's industrial policy of subsidies and tax and regulatory preferences. It's a greater breach in terms of free market economics. And you hear very little opposition or complaint from other Republicans about what the president is doing. So it's sort of hard for a small business or a small government or economic conservative to look at today's GOP and think, well, that's the vehicle through which I can get my ideas promoted and perhaps implemented. This division has been developing, but I think recently it has become undeniable.
Yeah, and this is my theory. Trump is, on the economy and other issues, he's moving to the left. I mean, that's what he's doing. And what that's doing is it's squeezing Democrats into a smaller and smaller space because they have almost an inability to go outside of it. But Bob, I look at the emergency clause, how the emergency clause is being utilized today by the Trump administration. It's not lost on me that all of these things that he's doing are going to be amplified when there is inevitably a new Democratic administration. They'll utilize the emergency clause to be able to get their agenda passed. And if you think taking 10% of a company was a big deal underneath a Republican, just wait till you see somebody like AOC, how she might see it if she were either president or the head of commerce. I mean, they would see it as absolutely it's something that they should take. So I'm worried not just about what's happening with this president, but where this goes from here. Your thoughts on that?
I agree. And it is, there reaches a point where the whataboutism can no longer, or fighting the actions of someone who is supposedly on your side, on the right, the Republican. The fact that the Democrats have done similar or might do worse if they get in charge can't, for small government conservatives or economic conservatives, be an excuse to say, well, we'll give Trump a pass. And unfortunately, I think too much of that happens. But you're exactly right. He's laying precedents that in the hands of Democrats will produce even more adverse results. But Trump's own results are sufficiently offensive to free market principles that I think it justifies declaring that and understanding that the GOP is no longer a political vehicle through which small government conservatives and economic conservatives can advance their ideas. That door has been closed.
So, Henry, I'm going to lay out a question here kind of in relationship to what Bob is saying. I find it interesting that Democrats tend to like bigger government. Well, in a way, Trump's delivering on that. I mean, the $150 billion that we're spending extra on immigrations today is bigger government program. It's just they're wearing masks. Here's what I find to be interesting. I think Democrats have a challenge in being able to respond because they start with it being automatically something that they feel that they have to resolve the problem. So I'll give you an example. On the issue of crime and sending in troops, Bob talked about sovereignty and whether or not a state should have sovereignty. And the states have been pretty much reacting negatively to that. Now, my opinion is that the reason Democrats have such a negative view of him sending in troops is they don't believe they're just going to be utilized to help fight crime. They think eventually they're going to be utilized by him as a national police to try to upset the next election, to try and stop democracy. That's how they see it. And with January 6th, who can blame them? I mean, if you'd had that in place, we knew that he had asked Miley and others to be able to utilize the military and turn them on citizens. So I don't blame them for seeing Trump as having the ability or the willingness to do that. On the other hand, I was mayor. I think progressives are destroying American cities. I think that the policies that they have that range in everything from not prosecuting low-level crimes that need to be prosecuted, all the way to not just defund the police, but demoralize the police by talking bad about them, by constantly barraging them with insults and talking about how they're the problem. All those things have created, as well as many others, they've created a failure amongst many of these inner cities on being able to fight crime, especially where progressives have had more control. So the question that I would say to Democrats is, or at least what I would lay at their doorstep is, you're partly to cause of this problem. You can't just lay this only on his doorstep. You have to stand up and take responsibility. The reason Trump is doing this, he doesn't really want to put troops in those states. And if he does, he'll do it for 2 weeks and pull them back out because he's not going to spend the money. He's doing it because it's a political wedge. And it's a wedge that works, that makes them look like they're not willing to do their job in fighting crime. And the reality is, in many cases, they're not. In many cases, they're on the other side.
Sometimes Bob makes a really good point on the show, which is that not enough elected officials in America, and maybe even other countries these days, are focused on governing, right? They're not focused on just doing the job for which they were elected. And I think that's one of Bob's best points, and I agree with him. In the case of the cities, a big part of city government is just providing for social order, right? Make sure that the fire department works, make sure that the police department works, make sure that there's not crime on the streets, make sure that the trash gets picked up. If Democrats had delivered on all of those things, then Donald Trump wouldn't have a leg to stand on. No one would think that there was anything worth sending in federal troops. But the shoe fits on both sides, right? The GOP also needs to focus more on governing at the national level and delivering economic growth, which is probably the most important things that federal governments are elected on. It's certainly the best predictor of presidential approval and presidential election outcomes is unemployment and economic growth going into the election. And so at the moment, we're seeing all of these elected officials that are catering to their base. This is something we talk about on the show all the time as well, instead of just delivering and governing and doing the job for which they're elected. Now, why they get away with it, it could just be because the base is so ideological. There's quite a lot of evidence for that at the local level, city council elections, et cetera, that we're seeing more polarization in the United States than we used to see, that these things are more and more matching up with state level and federal level polarization. But surely most Americans at some point are going to say enough is enough, and they're going to just want to elect maybe boring centrist politicians who just want to deliver. Now, I know Bob doesn't agree with me, but
mainstream.
Yeah, do the job, right? You had a job, do the job. If you don't, you get kicked out. It might be a long path back to when we see those kind of politicians getting elected. But as the eternal optimist here, I think that day might be not too far away.
All right, Bob, I'm going to test something off of you. I'm going to test off of you my crazy idea of the week. And I can see all different types of reasons why it may not be liked, but I'm going to run this by you and see how you see it. So again, I'm an independent today, but I was a Democratic mayor during the time that I was mayor. And I would say I had a very good relationship with PD. I had a belief that it was important for us to make certain that our citizens were safe. And probably not lost on me that the people who appointed me the first time to being mayor actually were conservatives and Republicans on the council. But in saying that, the crazy idea is this. If I were Democratic mayors today, I would actually say to Trump, and I'd do this in unison, hey, we're in. We'd like you to send the troops. In fact, we'd like you to send them for 2 years because 1 month isn't going to do it. And oh, by the way, don't send them with masks. Don't send them in their battle fatigues with their M16s. Get some MP stamps, put them on the side of their shoulders. And in fact, we'll put them through a training. And if they take our training, we'll put them first in line when they leave the reserves to being in the police department. And we don't really need you in downtown because that's not really where we have a problem. I'll tell you where we have a problem. We have a problem in some really rough neighborhoods in Phoenix where I think I can go get the neighborhood to join in a block watch or join in walking with you. Help us go walk those neighborhoods for a year and a half or 2 years. I have no doubt it would make those neighborhoods safer. I also have no doubt there's no way they'd do it because they're not going to spend that kind of money. But instead, they put themselves into a position where they look like they're on the wrong side of fighting crime. And that, to me, is one of the big issues here is how bad Democrats are failing in providing leadership. The only thing they can think of is, how do we oppose Donald Trump? And my answer to that is, sometimes maybe you don't. But that doesn't mean that you have to take him up on, we're going to send out people with masks or battle fatigues or M16s and drive around in Humvees that look like your city's under occupation. You really want to do something about crime? You really want to send out the reserves? We've got a way to do that. Thoughts on my crazy idea for the week?
I think as a political stratagem, it has a lot of merit, and I think you're correct. It would call Trump's bluff. My problem is that it concedes the violation of two, I think, important principles or tenets. The first is the dual sovereignty role that we talked about before, that street crime is any business of the federal government, simply violates the principles of federalism, where you handle problems at the lowest level, and that the failure to handle it at the municipal level isn't a excuse or rationale for federal intervention. You have to rely upon the democratic response that Henry described. And we're seeing that to a certain extent, for instance, in San Francisco, where a centrist Democrat committed to actually cleaning up the social disorder in that city has been elected, and so far seems to be off to a pretty good start. The second principle that is violated, I think, is even more potentially dangerous, which is the notion of using the military in law enforcement. That has been a bright line in the United States from the time of our founding. I think the Democrats are correct that Trump is trying to blur that line. And I think it's a line that, in terms of preserving liberty and democracy, needs to remain bright.
Yeah, I actually agree it needs to remain bright also, but I also think without political stratagem, without the ability to be able to push back on him, he may actually end up getting a local law enforcement group. And I'm not sure where that goes. Henry, I'll take this maybe one further step. So let's go to legitimate Republican and Democratic players on this, meaning the people who really do care about the issues and they want to make things work, and they're out there. I mean, I know people on both sides of the ledger who really do care about trying to make the system work as opposed to being in a political food fight. It seems to me that on the Republican side, both groups, by the way, even on immigration, I think believe in the rule of law. On the Republican side, they want the rule of law to create border enforcement. They want the borders to be enforced. On the Democratic side, they support the rule of law. They want people to be treated humanely. They want to make certain that they have a right to a fair trial, that people aren't being abused. Interestingly enough, I think the public agrees with both of those two things. Now, the reality is, the reason we're not getting them is because they're not paying attention to what the other side is saying, which is valid. They both have a valid point on this. And again, I'm talking about the legitimate people on this, not the people who are just trying to figure out, how do I get a headline this week and make it look like the other side is evil and bad and doing horrible things? That seems to me to be the area where we start really trying to find the answers to these problems, which is trying to look at what both groups are trying to accomplish that's legitimate, and then playing to that and trying to build a coalition amongst it. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. At the moment, I know that Democratic activist groups are mobilizing people around resisting police searches that are motivated by looking for illegal immigrants, sort of teaching people how to know about their civil rights to prevent the police entering their home and or into their vehicle and all these sorts of things. And these are all things that are, as you say, playing themselves out behind the border, right? Whereas Republicans are much more motivated in securing the border as a sort of impermeable barrier to migrants who aren't there illegally, when of course there's also this step in the legal process that people are allowed to claim asylum, at least under pretty broad circumstances in the United States. So yeah, you've got different factions appealing to different parts of the legal system around immigration. They're very sort of vocal about these things, but at the core of it, of course, is the fact that the reason why they're so motivated about these issues is that they know that the other team, the Republicans or the Democrats, are on the other side of the issue, right? So why are all the Democratic activists turning up to these mobilization sessions about resisting police entry of their houses? I mean, this to me seems like a very unlikely proposition for most of my Democratic friends and neighbors, and yet they're going to these information sessions. And the reason they're going is because they're so mobilized by their partisan identity. They want to resist Trump's immigration enforcement agenda in any way that they can. And I would say a similar thing on the other side with Republicans who might say things about immigrants or call for policies that could be interpreted as inhumane. I don't think that they're supporting those things for any intrinsic reason, except for that they know that it's against what the other side is saying. So all of these things are politicized. And yes, they are appealing to different aspects of the rule of law or civility or basic, treating your fellow man in a humane way. But I don't think that they're able to agree, because at the core of what they're supporting is this antagonism towards the other political faction, and in the case of the Democrats, towards Donald Trump.
I think it gets back to of not having a critical mass of elected officials who want to govern. And I would sort of contrast what's happening at the state legislature in Arizona with what is happening in Congress. There are partisan divides and partisan fights that occur in the Arizona legislature. But a lot of bills get passed every year, and the overwhelming majority of them are bipartisan, and an awful lot of them have very little dissent. In Congress, it seems like you never get to that agenda. If one side or the other advances an idea that has bipartisan support, the party out of power will try to attach things to it that do not enjoy the bipartisan support. I can't really identify all the factors that lead the Arizona legislature to still be somewhat productive in this era of heightened partisanship, and why Congress is not. But the difference is fairly stark. And I think it gets back to not having a critical mass of members of Congress who want to govern rather than engage in political posturing. My guess is if they would devote 2 weeks of passing legislation that both sides agree on, we would be stunned at how productive it would be.
All right. So let's shift a little bit on this, and that's to this potential shutdown that's coming. And Bob, I'm going to start with you on this question. One of the things that I think many political analysts are saying is that Democrats have been pretty much without power. Democrats, since the election, they lost the House, they lost the Senate, they lost the presidency, that they've just been without power. And so many Democratic analysts are urging the Democratic Party to allow the government to shut down, and at least to allow it to shut down if they're not able to accomplish a certain set of objectives. Now, therein lies the problem. Nobody agrees on what the objectives might be. Like, to me, it might make sense to them if they were to focus on the economy and tariffs. I don't think they would do that. It might even make sense if they were focused on mass police and whether or not people are going to be treated humanely. But my guess is they'll They'll focus on something like Medicaid or Medicare or healthcare or maybe 25 things. Or maybe they'll fold. If you were giving the Democratic Party advice on this one of the things that we've seen over and over again is that the group who shuts down the government ends up taking the blame for it. It's a failure. They end up failing, and the failure is put on the people who end up becoming the obstructionists. How do you see that issue, and how would you advise them?
I think there's a larger problem, and I don't know how the Democrats should responsibly respond to the situation that they face. It requires Democratic votes to keep the government running because of the filibuster rule. I'm opposed to the filibuster rule. If that didn't exist, this wouldn't be a dilemma for them. But at present, it requires Democratic votes to keep the government operating. The problem is that Donald Trump has declared himself in unequivocal terms unbound or unconstrained by anything that Congress passes, including appropriations. So what possibly could Republicans agree to provide Democrats that they should have any reason to believe that Donald Trump would abide by? He's declared himself unconstrained by whatever Congress does or passes. And I do see the political situation a little differently. I think when there's a government shutdown, the instinct of the American people is to blame the Republicans on the grounds that Democrats like government. They want to keep it open. And Republicans are skeptical about government and perhaps don't mind seeing it shut down for a while. Now, we've never had a situation where it was the Democrats that shut down the government by failing to provide the votes than the Republicans. That's always been, at least in my memory, the Republicans have been the moving factor on not providing the votes and shutting down the government. So if the Democrats uniformly opposed anything and the government shut down, that presents a new political question to the American people. And maybe they would blame the Democrats, as you indicated. But I do believe there's an instinct. The Democrats like government. They don't want to shut it down. And Republicans are more skeptical about the enterprise.
You know, it would never happen. But I loved when Bill Clinton lost the House and he came back immediately and said the era of big government is over, right? It's like he tried to steal their issue right out from underneath them. You're talking about the small government issue. Many of the challenges that Democrats are facing today, because government just got a lot bigger over the last 8 months. And that bigger didn't serve them the way that they wanted to serve them. And maybe they had to start thinking about maybe big government isn't necessarily what they should be interested in if it's liberty and fairness and freedom that matters to them. Again, second crazy idea of the day is maybe Democrats ought to come back and say, hey, we agree with the conservatives. Let's balance the budget. You balance the budget and we'll agree to passing the budget. I don't know how they do that with leaving $150 billion in place for the guys, the masked men who are now out on our streets.
One of the questions I've had, Paul, and you hit on it, is whether what they're seeing, not just the Democrats, but liberals in general and young people, seeing Donald Trump's big government, whether it will shake the belief in the value of big government once they've seen how it can be misused in ways that they disapprove of by Donald Trump. I'm not seeing any indication of that at present, but I think it's a fascinating question, and that it would be worthwhile for some of us who believe in smaller government to be investing in trying to communicate that point of view. Okay, you've seen what big government can become. Wouldn't we be better off protecting ourselves against this potential outcome by returning to the federalist system that we were originally intended to have? I think it's a fascinating question and a very important one.
Yeah, I think it is an important one, and I think they're seeing the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if you watch governments that fall, I don't believe Donald Trump may have authoritarian instincts. I don't see this as being an authoritarian state. I think that's mislabeling. I think we're losing the balance of power. I think that that's a big risk, and I think losing that balance of power is a huge challenge for us. But at least Trump is letting them know, hey, here's what you could do with government. And again, I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. If he wanted or someone else wanted to take it even further, it could even be much more damaging to our liberties, our freedom, and to the values that liberals, at least the liberals I used to know, hold dear. Henry, your thoughts on this?
When I look at the Democrats' predicament right now, we talked about it a lot last week. I think that they are pretty demoralized at the moment. And I think that turnout is going to be absolutely critical for them next year, plus the economy. We've seen some bad jobs reports. I think if unemployment continues to tick up, if inflation keeps running at 3% a year or thereabouts, I don't think that's a good economic recipe for the incumbents. So that gives the Democrats a leg up. But there's this deep sense of despondency that they don't seem to know how to respond to the Trump administration, and that they don't have a clear plan going forward. They have to get their voters out to the polls. Now, whether shutting down the government gives them something to rally around, I'm not sure. Paul, you probably know more than I do about what's going to rally the Democratic base at this point and give them a sense that they can actually win, because that's what they need to be able to turn out next year. But I don't view the government shutdown as being absolutely critical in this story. The thing that I'm watching really closely is the economy. I think the economy is going to be critical for the midterms, and the midterms are absolutely vital for the Democrats at this point. They have to win the House at the midterms in order to slow down or stop the Trump agenda. That will give them some momentum going into 2028. And that's what I'm most interested in for next year.
So to answer your question specifically, and then I'm going to stick on the economy just as the last question that we have here. But look, Democrats want leadership. And I think the whole reason that they like what Gavin Newsom is doing is at least it's some type of leadership, right? It's somebody staking out some ground. Pritzker seemed to have a fairly good week. But the challenge that Democrats have is that they've locked themselves in ideologically. I know the way politics works, and I know the way the Democratic Party works really well. I guarantee you they don't want to do anything to upset their progressives. And that boxes them in. They're just boxed, right? They're boxed on the economy. They're boxed on economic issues. They're boxed on immigration. They're boxed on the crime issue. They put themselves into a position because they're afraid to speak out, so they don't. They don't speak out. Now, some people look at this issue and say, well, if you shut down the government, at least it's strong. Yeah, that's true. If you do that, at least it looks like you're acting. But then the question's going to be, for what? Why are you doing it? Right? And I'll make a bet, you're going to have one group who's going to be saying, well, it's about the economy and tariffs. And somebody else is going to be saying, no, it's we think that you should have his and her pronouns at the end of things, and people aren't being treated right in whatever department. You won't have a unified message because effectively they can't provide it. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a jump on the economic issue. You're right. I think that I wish this weren't so. I would love to see Donald Trump's tariffs have been a magnificent success. I really would have, because I'm in business, right? This podcast doesn't pay my way. I pay my way by going out and running a business. The business pays for this. That
Bob, that's
I
just
want
what
it
he
to be
says, so
successful.
he doesn't have to
Yeah.
start paying us. All right, that's
But-
just what he says to us,
But
so he doesn't have to
the
start
reality
paying us.
is, as much as they're saying across the board, we're seeing really bad numbers. And I, you can argue whether or not the labor report was accurate or inaccurate, but I'm seeing it in a variety of areas. There are three main things that are happening. Tariffs are causing a problem just in the idea that it's causing an increase of prices in production. Effectively, about half of the cost of tariffs end up going to the production side, half go to consumers. The second problem that we're having is interest rates. And interest rates, I think, are being driven largely by what's happened with the federal deficit. But then there's the third issue, and it's just instability. What's going to happen with the feds? What's going to happen with the dollar? What's going to take place with tariffs? The answers are so unclear, and investors don't like to invest when it's unclear. And you start to add those three things up, and we're just seeing challenges across the board. Now, here's my question. That's not just a federal issue, that becomes a state issue. Karen Taylor Robeson, who's running for governor on the Republican side, hit Katie Hobbs this week by making the claim, hey, she's going to have to answer for why we've had such anemic job growth numbers. In fact, if you look at the job growth number, we went from second in the country to, I think it's 47th. We dropped dramatically. Now, the question that I have is, I could see where you could tie that back to, well, this is part of what's taking place at the federal level, but you're still going to have to answer the question of, but why did your state do so much worse than others? And I think you're going to see around the country a lot of this issue being put back onto Democratic candidates by, especially those that have been in charge, by saying, hey, here's the challenge with it. By the way, I'll state this for a moment. Arizona's economy still is like third or fourth in terms of one of the best poised economies. And if you look at quality of life and other issues, we seem to be doing fairly well. But it is also a real issue that we've not done a great job on creating new jobs. And my own personal opinion is a governor ought to be a promoter in chief. That's what they ought to be doing, is out trying to promote how do you bring jobs back into a community. Saying that, I'm really more interested in the political issue, which is this going to be just a federal issue, or will this also be a localized issue as well? And how do you see that?
I think that the jobs question is going to become the predominant one late this year and into early next year, because I don't see a lot of positive signals for the job market at this point. Everything seems to be a headwind of varying speeds, including AI seems to be hurting hiring for junior white-collar employees and even in computer science and things. So I think the jobs question is going to become absolutely critical. And I agree with you that the interest rate situation is more complicated than just the Fed lowering its short-term interest rates. A big thing that needs to happen in this economy is people need to be able to refinance their homes, to be able to free up cash and be able to move. And that's going to be a big thing for labor mobility. It's going to be a big thing for purchasing power. And I'm not sure that a big decline in interest rates is coming, because the long run federal deficit situation at this point looks so dire that your 30-year mortgage rate may not shift as much in response to the Fed rate changes as people expect. So I'm not super bullish on the American economy going into the end of this year and early next year. Of course, there's more than a year until the midterm elections, but I think that the jobs and interest rate question is just going to dominate the conversation and dominate people's lives for the next 6 or 8 months.
Yeah, and if we've talked a lot about our political party, the what's now called the No Labels Party, but I don't know, we may take up Bob's advice and call it the Independent Party before we're done here. My advice to that group is make the economy the number one issue, and in fact, make the deficit the number one issue, because those interest rates are directly tied to that deficit as well as to tariffs. But Bob, do you see this as not only having, do you think that the economic issues, if they continue along the current path, are as problematic at a local level as they are a national level, and maybe specifically in Arizona? Do you think that it's problematic for our current governor, especially if she's running against someone like Karen Taylor Robson?
Potentially. I think bad economic times tend to be anti-incumbent times, irrespective of political party. Bad economic times tend to be bad for incumbents of either party. So it's certainly possible that the economy may be able to be used by Republicans against Katie Hobbs in the Arizona governor's race. I'm a little skeptical of these quarter by quarter results that show Arizona plummeting so sharply on various measures. There hasn't been any change in the fundamentals of the Arizona economy that would suggest that. We may be simply getting the early edge of the adverse effects of Trump's economic policies. But if it persists, there will be a blame game played between the governor and the Republicans in the legislature who are still in control. And again, you can't really point to any fundamentals that Katie Hobbs has changed that would make the Arizona economy worse. To the extent there's been a change in fundamentals in the Arizona economy, it would be housing affordability and a greater awareness of the seriousness of our future water problems. But I don't know why that would create a sudden reduction compared to other states in, for example, job creation. But I do think that bad economic times, the electorate really doesn't try to sort out why that is occurring. They just want to change in direction, and it, I think, leads to an anti-incumbent trend every place.
Yeah, it's less coattails. I agree with you. It's instead of it being Democrat and Republican, it oftentimes become incumbents versus non-incumbents. On this issue of the economy, hopefully we'll have Elliot back next week and we'll spend more time talking about it. But gentlemen, thank you very much for today. We appreciate your guys' contribution, and thanks for being a regular part of New Frontiers.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.